Chapter 65. Who will bail her out? At the police station. Judgia was bailed out by a friend. Before leaving, she glanced triumphantly at Ella. Her eyes carried a bitter resentment. "I'll make you understand what happens when you try to compete with me for Mr. Jin. If you're smart, you'd better step aside on your own." Ella looked at her, unable to suppress a laugh. Judgia exploded in anger, shouting, "What are you laughing at? Look at yourself, you don't even have a friend. When something goes wrong, there's no one to bail you out. What do you have to compete with me?" Hearing this, Ella was stunned. A sudden pain struck her heart. Yes, how had she managed to get herself into such a state? In trouble, she didn't even have a friend. She lowered her head, letting out a bitter smile. Since the police asked her to call someone to bail her out, she had remained silent. Her phone wasn't with her, and she couldn't remember her colleagues' numbers. Throughout her life, there were only a few numbers she had memorized. Judgia left, and a police officer came over again. "Ella, try to think of even one number. You can't really spend the night in the police station, can you?" This caused Ella to frown. Of course not. If she didn't reach out, no one would know she was locked up, and she wouldn't be able to leave. Realizing this, she bit her lip. "Let me try." The police handed her the phone. Ella hesitated for a moment, then dialed the number she had memorized for so many years, the director's mobile number. The call was quickly answered, and Ella breathed a sigh of relief. "Director, it's Ella." But the voice on the other end was not the familiar gentle one, but a sharp, disdainful tone. "Ella? What do you want?" Ella's expression turned cold. "Mandy, I need to talk to the director." Pass the phone to her. "The director is asleep. Tell me what you need, I'll let her know." Ella clenched her fists tightly. Her heart was stabbed again. A sense of abandonment and loneliness enveloped her. She had grown up with the director, who had once cherished her, but when had they drifted apart? She let out a bitter smile, suddenly feeling quite pointless. But something seemed off. Ella suddenly thought of something and immediately spoke up. "Mandy, didn't you move out of the orphanage? Why are you with the director?" Mandy sneered. "Because I wasn't feeling well today, that's why the director came to check on me." Ella clutched the phone tightly and suddenly let out a mocking laugh. "Do you realize I'm at the police station?" There was a pause, seemingly caught off guard by her question, then Mandy awkwardly replied, "What are you talking about? I don't understand." Ella, however, understood instantly. She remained silent, and Mandy couldn't suppress her mocking smile. "Yes, I know you're at the police station, needing bail. But the director is asleep, she's so tired, how can I wake her?" "Maybe you should wait until tomorrow morning. When the director wakes up, I'll tell her." "Ella, I've been kicked out of the orphanage, living in this cramped place, and you, spending a night in the police station. What does that mean?" Chapter 66. I won't leave. "Mandy, who's on the phone?" As Mandy spoke, the director's voice came through from the other side. "Oh, Director Mom, it's nothing. You're so tired, go back to sleep." The call was abruptly cut off by Mandy. Ella knew that even if she called back, Mandy would likely have turned off her phone. She stood there, shoulders drooping. The sight of her moved the police officer. "Ella, don't you have any other relatives?" There was one other person whose number she remembered, but that person. Ella shook her head, handing the phone back to the officer. "It's okay, without evidence, they'll release me automatically after 24 hours, right?" After saying this, she lowered her head and returned to the room. She sat on the bed, hugging her knees, her head buried, her shoulders shaking slightly. But she wasn't crying, she was laughing. Her life was simply too ridiculous. For over 20 years, all the people she had truly cared about had drifted away. When Mr. Edward arrived at the police station, he saw her like this. The girl curled up in the corner, shrinking into a tiny ball. As if the whole world had left her alone. His heart clenched tightly, as if he had suddenly inhaled a gulp of cold air, his lungs even twitched. He stood there, momentarily unsure of what to do. Guilt flooded him like a breaking dam. How could he have scolded her like that? She had clearly wanted to explain, but he hadn't listened, hurting her so deeply. Mr. Edward watched her for a long time, not speaking, and the officer accompanying him couldn't help but speak up. "Ella, someone's here to bail you out." Someone to bail her out? Could it be the director? Ella's eyes lit up slightly as she slowly raised her head, only to see a towering figure at the door. She thought she was mistaken, rubbed her eyes, and looked again. It was indeed Mr. Edward. Her brightened eyes gradually darkened, and she scoffed with a hint of scorn. She looked at Mr. Edward with cold, distant eyes. "So it's Chief." After saying this, she looked forward, no longer looking at him, as if pouting, "I don't need you to bail me out. After all, I've brought shame to the Edward family, haven't I? Don't worry, I won't claim any relationship with the Edward family." This remark drew several frowns on Mr. Edward's forehead. At least she was talking to him, which was a good sign. He looked at the girl, asking, "Are you coming or not?" "I won't leave," Ella stubbornly declared, then lay down on the bed, her hands behind her head. "I suddenly feel like staying here is not bad." The officer looked at the two of them, coughed once. "Ella, you should go." "I won't." The girl was very stubborn. Mr. Edward's gaze deepened. "Open the door." The officer, puzzled, unlocked the door. Mr. Edward pushed the door open and strode in, standing in front of Ella. Ella grew wary. "What are you doing? This is a police station. If you dare to hit someone here." Before she could finish, she felt a whirl of dizziness, and when she came to, she was already in Mr. Edward's arms. Without saying a word, he scooped her up in his arms and strode out. Chapter 67, Ella's Transformation. The man carried the familiar scent of vanilla, mixed with a faint whiff of alcohol, which strangely smelled pleasant. But that wasn't the main point. The key was, how did she end up being carried out? When Ella came to her senses, she had already left the police station. She instinctively started struggling. "What are you doing?" "Put me down," I said. "I won't leave." But her struggles proved futile against Mr. Edward's strength. Mr. Edward held her tightly, feeling the girl's movements weaken, and he strode towards his car. However, as he walked, he suddenly felt a warmth and wetness in his arms, and he hurriedly looked down. Under the moonlight, he could see the girl's pale face, her eyes shedding large tears, her cheeks streaked with them, looking extremely helpless. Mr. Edward panicked instantly. He halted. "You." He didn't know what else to say. In the business world, he was always decisive, commanding. But now, the girl's crying left him at a loss. Ella didn't want to cry, as tears never solved problems and only made her seem weak and useless. But at this moment, she simply couldn't hold back. Sobbing, her tears couldn't be stopped. All her grievances came pouring out with this crying. She cried like a wronged child. The night breeze blew gently. Mr. Edward looked at her. It seemed there were no other sounds, no other people in the world. Just her. Even her crying was so unrestrained, so bold. Mr. Edward felt something in his heart change quietly at that moment. But what exactly it was, he didn't know. He only knew that if he could make the girl smile, if she could be like she was before, he would do anything. After an unknown time, the girl seemed to have cried herself out. She sobbed, wiping her tears with her sleeve. Such a rough action, which he would have found appalling before, now seemed somewhat heart-wrenching. He quickly opened the car door, pulled out some tissues, and handed them to her. Ella didn't take them, just swaying slightly. Mr. Edward hastily steadied her, speaking in a gentle, consultative tone. "Let's get in the car first, okay?" Having skipped dinner and cried this whole time, with her injuries not yet healed and having lost a lot of blood, Ella felt dizzy. Hearing this, she neither refused nor agreed, but felt Mr. Edward helping her towards the car, and she didn't resist. Once seated in the back, she immediately curled up her body, clearly keeping her distance from him. Mr. Edward gazed, his stare deepening. Then, he saw the girl looking out the window, not wanting to talk to him. He opened his mouth, the words "I'm sorry" lingering on his lips but unable to be spoken. At that moment, the phone suddenly rang. He instinctively picked it up and answered. Only then did he realize that the phone he picked up seemed to be Ella's, which she had left in his car. As he was pondering this, he heard Mandy's voice on the other end. "Ella, the director is asleep. You should find someone else to bail you out. Let me tell you, from now on, the director is my mom alone, she has no more ties with you. Stay away from us, got it?" Chapter 68, His Thoughtfulness. Upon hearing this, Mr. Edward's eyes darkened, and a fierce anger suddenly surged within him. He turned to look at the girl, only able to see her back as she gazed out the window. He had wondered why, after several hours of her being detained, no one had come to bail her out. It turned out she hadn't tried to call anyone, she already had. He gripped his phone tightly, his jaw set, and directly asked, "Who are you?" The person on the other end was slightly taken aback, reflexively responding, "Who are you?" Moments later, realization dawned, "Are you a cop?" "Officer, let me tell you, this Ella is trouble. Grew up in an orphanage, loves to fight. I bet she's the one who started it, so handle her accordingly. She needs to learn her lesson." Mr. Edwards' gaze grew colder. I asked, "Who are you?" I'm a friend from the orphanage, my name's Mandy. If you need anything from me, I can cooperate." To cooperate in punishing Ella? Mr. Edward lowered his eyes and abruptly ended the call. Then he turned, only to find the girl had not turned around the entire time. Her head rested against the window, her body tightly hugged, as if asleep. Mr. Edward immediately turned to the driver, "Turn off the air conditioning." "Yes." He then removed his own coat, wanting to drape it over her. But his hand paused mid-air. He remembered the look of resistance in her eyes when she saw him, hesitated, and finally set his coat down. When Ella woke up, it was already the next morning. She opened her eyes, staring blankly at the ceiling for a long time before realizing she was in her bedroom. Last night, in a hazy state, she remembered being carried upstairs. Mr. Edward carrying her was something she was aware of, but she was too exhausted to open her eyes or wake up, eventually giving up the struggle. Now, her head ached, and her eyes were swollen. Ella sighed. She stood up, washed up, and found several eggs placed on the coffee table in her bedroom. Ella raised her eyebrows, picked them up, and began to apply them to her eyes. After a few rounds, feeling much better, she stood up and went downstairs. A new day meant new work awaited. At least she needed to sort out last night's incident. If Judge insisted she had assaulted her, the subsequent issues could become troublesome. While Ella was contemplating this, she received a call from the police station. "Ella, could you please come to the police station?" At the station, as Ella walked in, Judge was holding a medical report detailing a second-degree minor injury, looking triumphant at her. "You see this? It's enough to detain you for at least 15 days. For someone like you, who refuses to admit it, they might just keep you for a month." Ella frowned. She sighed, trying to reason with Judge, "Mr. Jin will be angry if he finds out about this. You'd better stop now." Judge scoffed. "Nonsense. Uncle won't blame me, he loves me so much. Just you wait. While you're in detention, I'll win him back." "Ella, this woman is delusional." As she pondered, a voice came from behind. "Who's this, making decisions for us cops right here in the station?" Chapter 69 Witness. Upon hearing this, Ella turned around, her eyes suddenly lighting up. The man who approached was exceptionally handsome, his looks rivaling those of celebrities. His upturned peach blossom eyes gave him a somewhat rakish appearance. He grinned, a smile that seemed rather cheeky. He strolled over, wearing the most formal and masculine attire, yet exuding an air of recklessness. Judge's eyes were glued to Oblique, and it took her a while to snap out of it. "Who are you?" A police officer immediately introduced. "This is our officer Oblique." Judge immediately adopted a pout. "Oblique, you're just in time, you must stand up for me." Sobbing, she attacked me. "Look at the bruises on me." She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the purple and blue marks. Oblique made a clucking sound. "That's quite the sight." Judge suddenly perked up, excited. "Exactly. Oblique, how should someone like that be punished?" Oblique stroked his chin as if seriously pondering. "Well, if the charges stick, with injuries like that, it could mean a couple of months in jail." Ella frowned, a bit puzzled by Oblique's approach, yet hearing this malicious tone, she quickly retorted, "But you don't have any evidence." Judge snorted. "Who says?" "I've found a server from the club who can testify that you hit me." Judge looked at a man standing beside her. "Tell them, did she hit me?" Ella finally noticed someone had been standing beside Judge the whole time. Her eyes widened. She hadn't expected Judge to find someone to perjure. She frowned as the man spoke up. I work at the Charming Club, my name's Jen." I can testify that she assaulted Miss Judger. After saying this, he lowered his head, no longer speaking. Ella stepped forward. Jen, making false testimony is illegal. You can't lie. Moreover, it was just the two of us in the private room. How did you see me hit her? Jen, frightened, glanced at Judger before speaking. I was just delivering dishes that day. I saw Miss Judger enter the private room, then heard the sounds of a scuffle from inside, so I peeked in. Seamless fabrication. Ella clenched her fists, hardly knowing what to say. She was so frustrated, feeling like she was being unjustly accused. Jen, I reiterate, perjury is illegal. Jen, intimidated by her gaze, took a step back. Judger stepped forward, shielding Jen from Ella. Ella, what are you doing? Threatening a witness. Oblique, won't you do something about this? Oblique cleared his throat. Miss Ella, no need to be so aggressive. Judger grew even more triumphant, her eyes sparkling. Oblique, now that we have all the evidence, can she be sentenced? Ella clenched her fists, frowning. Seeing this, Oblique stepped forward, his peachy eyes glancing between Ella and Judger before settling on Jen. Well, I hereby declare that Jen is involved in perjury and will be detained for 15 days. Judger's triumphant gaze at Ella turned into a stunned expression upon hearing Oblique's word. Chapter 70. May I pursue her? What? Judger's voice grew sharp. Oblique, did you make a mistake? Ella was also shocked. She had thought she was doomed today. But instead, the situation had suddenly taken a dramatic turn. The world felt surreal. Jen was baffled. Officer Oblique, I didn't commit perjury. I told the truth. Oblique smirked. Jen, what do you do at the Charming Club? Jen hesitated, stammering, I do odd jobs. Oblique's smile vanished, his demeanor suddenly imposing. Jong Jen, male, 22 years old, currently working as a handyman at the Charming Club, specifically washing dishes and prepping vegetables for chefs. Let me ask you, how would someone in your position be sent to deliver dishes? The words left both Jen and Judger pale. The Charming Club had strict management, otherwise, Mr. Edward wouldn't frequent it for business. Judger had tried to bribe a server, but the staff's high standards made them unapproachable, leading her to settle on Jen. She hadn't expected him to be immediately exposed by Oblique. Jen's legs went limp, and he collapsed into the chair, no longer daring to speak. Judger, on the other hand, clamped her mouth shut even tighter, afraid to say anything more. Oblique looked at them with satisfaction and laughed again. Now, Miss Judger, do you have anything else to say? Judger swallowed. No, nothing. Only then did Oblique nod. Miss Ella did not assault Miss Judger, so she is released without charge. Do you have any objections, Miss Judger? Judger shook her head. Oblique glanced at Ella once more before turning to leave. Upon entering his office, he took off his coat and tossed it onto the sofa, then picked up his phone and dialed a number. Shun Shun. If you call me that again, next time I'll rip out your tongue. The cold tone sent a chill down Oblique's tongue, and he coughed immediately. Hey, bro, I handled your business. Oh. Bro, I did you a favor, you've got to reward me somehow, right? Grab a bottle of Romani Conti from your cabinet. Serving society is your duty. Anything else? So he was stood up last night, and today he worked for him for nothing? Oblique rubbed his chin. Bro, you've got good taste, huh? I really looked at that girl today, her eyes are so bright. She's damn gorgeous. No wonder even our perennial iceberg is moved. Hey, that's my sister. What? Oh, well, if she's your sister, can I pursue her? The response to Oblique was the beep beep of the call being disconnected. Mr. Edward hung up the phone. Oblique put down the phone, puzzled. Why did it feel like Shun Shun was a bit unhappy? As Ella left the police station, she kept looking back, feeling that today's events were somehow unusually strange. After all, fabricating a false testimony like Jen's should require investigation and evidence, right? But how did that Oblique seem to be so well prepared? She suddenly thought of Mr. Edward's unexpected visit last night. How did he know she was at the police station? Could it be that Oblique helped her today because... Chapter 71. Her professional bottom line. There was only one reason that could explain everything. She wasn't narcissistic enough to think that a bleak had fallen for her at first sight. A wave of emotion stirred within her. Yesterday, Mr. Edward had misunderstood her so badly, and it had really angered and hurt her. But this man. She took a deep breath. Ella, you can't be so spineless. He's just playing good cop, bad cop. With that thought, she suppressed the emotions in her heart. As she looked up, she saw the director and Mandy standing in front of her, staring at her. Ella clenched her fists and walked over to the director, pretending nothing was wrong. She smiled at the director. Mandy then spoke up, I told the director about your detention, and she rushed over to bail you out. So, are you okay now? Ella narrowed her eyes and nodded. Just as she was about to speak, the director suddenly said, Ella, let's not do this job anymore, okay? Ella was taken aback. The director looked at her, love affair terminator, it sounds nice, but isn't it just helping men deceive their wives? Ella, this profession crosses moral boundaries. Women are already a vulnerable group, and you're doing this, even if it's for money, you. The director didn't finish. Ella understood the meaning from her eyes. She despised her profession and questioned her character. Ella had thought she was used to the director's distrust, but in that moment, she felt like the air had been sucked out of her chest, leaving her suffocating. She looked at the director, her throat tight, and after a long pause, she smiled wryly. Director, our industry also has its moral standards. We don't take cases lightly, we always. Before she could finish, Mandy sternly interjected, Ella, all you're doing is for money, right? One case in this industry can bring a big payday, but do you know how many innocent people you're hurting? None of them noticed a black car slowly driving in. Mr. Edward, who was at the wheel, had come to pick up Ella, but he hadn't expected to see the confrontation among the three. He narrowed his eyes, parked the car, and listened as Mandy accused, his hand on the door handle, ready to get out, but Ella's cold laugh stopped him. He paused. Ella looked at the two in front of her, always standing on moral high grounds to criticize her. But they knew nothing about the inside story. Her phone suddenly rang. Ella glanced at it, answered it directly, and put it on speaker. A tired female voice came from the other end. Ella, what's the progress with my husband and Judgia? Ella replied, Mrs. Jin, there's been progress. Don't worry, I'll handle it. Mrs. Jin sighed, well, my husband and Judgia were just drunk that one night, and now she's clinging to him, threatening to kill herself unless he divorces me. We're at a loss. You must help me protect my family and persuade Judgia to leave. Ella looked up, mocking the director and Mandy. Chapter 72. I, Ella, stand unashamed before heaven and earth. Ella looked at the two in front of her and slowly spoke into the phone. Mrs. Jin, don't worry, I will definitely help you with this. Mrs. Jin's voice was heavy, thank you. Ella ended the call. She gripped her phone tightly, looking at the director and Mandy. Then, she spoke word by word. I, Ella, have no parents, no one to guide me, but in this life, I stand unashamed before heaven and earth in everything I do. After saying this, she glanced at Mandy and turned to leave. The director stood there dumbfounded, her lips moving as if to say something, but seeing Ella's back, she felt any words would be futile. She had once again misjudged Ella, questioned her character. Mandy looked at the director, conflicted, and suddenly called out, Ella. Ella stopped but didn't turn back. Mandy took a step forward, pointing at her, the director is saying this for your own good. We've both grown up with the director as our mother. What's wrong with you taking her words? Ella narrowed her eyes. Director, or mother as she called her. She was nagging, and indeed, she had heard a lot of scolding growing up. But the old director at least wouldn't be so biased, now it seemed whatever Mandy said was right. She suddenly felt arguing with them was pointless. So she said nothing more, and walked out, head held high. Ella, we're talking to you, what kind of attitude is that? Mandy tried to follow, but as she stepped forward, a car suddenly stopped in front of her. Mandy and the director stopped, looking up to see Ella had left the police station. The window of the luxury black car rolled down slowly, revealing Mr. Edward's expressionless face. Liang Meng glanced, immediately startled. She stepped back. You, Mr. Edward, why are you here? Mr. Edward glanced indifferently, looked at his watch, and then said, "Where do you work?" Mandy, though wary, didn't dare lie under Mr. Edward's gaze, answered, I work at Pure Design." Pure Design? It just happened to be a subsidiary under Edward family's branch. Mr. Edward remembered this company because they had a design hit last year, which was praised at the annual meeting. Mr. Edward nodded, then rolled up the window, started the car, and left the police station. Mandy and the director looked at each other, both baffled. Mandy couldn't help but ask, "What does Mr. Edward mean by this?" The director was worried, but some things she didn't say. First, when Ella was sent to the orphanage, the Edward family had only entrusted her to take good care, and such a scandal of the wealthy could not be revealed. Second, the two children who grew up together. If Mandy found out that Ella was now the Edward family's eldest daughter, she would definitely be unhappy. But what did Mr. Edward want with Mandy's job? The director felt a pang of anxiety. Chapter 73, You're Fired. Mr. Edward drove slowly on the road, his gaze fixed on the small yet stubborn figure ahead. His gaze deepened. He remembered how Ella had stood there and proclaimed, "I, Ella, stand unashamed before heaven and earth in everything I do." That girl at that moment was something he couldn't take his eyes off. How did she manage to shout such powerful words with her slender body? And when the orphanage director misjudged her character, she was so angry. So what about when he had mistaken her for a mistress? Mr. Edward frowned. He picked up his phone, scrolled through it for a while, found the number of the head of Pure Design, and dialed it. The phone connected, and a vigorous male voice came through. "Hello, who is this?" The tone wasn't great. Mr. Edward lowered his eyes. "It's me, Mr. Edward." "Mr. Edward? What can I do for you?" The tone immediately shifted from stern to servile. Mr. Edward paused, then asked, "Isn't today a work day?" "Yes, it is." "Isn't it working hours now?" "Yes, it is." "Is Mandy on a personal errand during work hours? Did she take leave?" "Ah. Isn't she in the office?" Mr. Edward lowered his eyes. Shoe Corporation doesn't need slack employees like that. Leaving the police station, the director was preoccupied, worried something might happen. She urged Mandy, "Mandy, go back to work." Mandy supported her arm. "Director, it's fine, I'll take you to the orphanage and then go to work." The director sighed. "No need, I can take the bus to the orphanage. It's not good for you to be out during work hours like this." Mandy dismissed it with a wave. "It's fine, our department is like this, designers are more casual. As long as the higher-ups don't take it seriously, it's fine." The director, however, felt a bit uneasy. She urged, "All right, go back to work, hurry." Mandy, actually a bit panicked when Mr. Edward asked about her job, seeing the director insist, no longer argued, "Okay, I just have a design draft to finish today, then I'll go to work." "You take care." She turned to leave. The director called her back. "Here's $100, take a taxi, don't squeeze on the bus, it's hard." Mandy took the money, went to the roadside, and took a taxi away. After she left, the director went to the bus stop and boarded the bus. Half an hour later, Mandy arrived at her company. She confidently walked towards her desk. Halfway there she met the department manager. Mandy smiled and greeted, "Mr. Harvey." Mr. Harvey stared at her. "Mandy, where have you been?" Mandy touched her hair. "I went to the restroom, Mr. Harvey. Did you need something?" Mr. Harvey chuckled mockingly. "Restroom? You were there for 2 hours?" Mandy's face stiffened, then she stepped forward, coquettishly. "Mr. Harvey, I had some personal matters, just went out for a bit, he." In the past, she would often skip work to help at the orphanage. But as long as she finished her work, the company wouldn't care. She thought this time would be the same, but unexpectedly, Mr. Harvey heard this and looked indifferent. "Mandy, you're fired." Chapter 74, Not Taking It. Standing outside the company with her belongings in her arms, Mandy still felt like she was in a dream. Pure Design, a place that every design student dreamed of working for. She had been hired there years ago, and she thought that she would at least have one thing over Ella in her life. But she never expected to be fired right after showing off to Ella. She stood there in a daze. Her first reaction wasn't about what to do next or what job to find, but how Ella would mock her if she found out. She hailed a taxi and headed straight for the orphanage. Upon arriving at the orphanage and knocking on the door, the director was shocked to see her with her things. "Mandy, what happened to you?" Mandy finally snapped back to reality, her items dropping to the ground as she bit her lip and tears fell. "Director, I've been fired." After leaving the police station, Ella went straight to her studio. Despite her leg injury, she knew she couldn't delay the work any longer. At the company, she found only a round-faced recent graduate, who stood up immediately upon seeing her. "Ella, you're here." Ella nodded. "Nova, where's Rupert?" There were only 3 people in the company, the girl in front of her named Nova, and a boy named Rupert. Nova shook her head directly. "I don't know, he's been acting mysterious lately, no idea what he's up to." Just as she finished speaking, Rupert's voice came from the doorway. "Ella, I've secured a big client for us." Ella turned to see Rupert, reeking of alcohol, stumbling in. He came straight to her and blurted out, "Ella, I went out today to negotiate a big client for you. This guy, a rich second generation, has 3 mistresses who are causing chaos. If we can keep this from his wife, we'll get this much." He then held up a hand. Nova's eyes lit up. 50,000. Rupert shook his head. 500,000. Nova gasped. "So much? He's rich, after all," Rupert said, then looked at Ella. "Ella, the contract is printed, just sign here and we'll get half the money up front." With that, he slammed the contract on the table with gusto. Ella stared at him, then lowered her gaze to the contract. After a while, she smirked, picked up the contract, and read it carefully. Rupert handed her a pen. "Ella, just sign." Ella looked at him, then suddenly pulled hard. Rip. The contract was torn in half. She threw it on the table with a slap, startling Nova and Rupert. Then, she narrowed her eyes at them, sternly saying, "Rupert, have you forgotten the company rules?" Rupert was taken aback. Ella said, "Rule number 5, we don't handle cases involving men who willingly have mistresses and hide it from their wives."